Alright, let's get into it. Number 10. The Heretic's Blade. In 2017, renovation workers lifting flagstones beneath a deconsecrated church in Erfurt, Germany, broke through the seal of a stone chamber that had not been opened in 8 centuries. Inside, wrapped in the remnants of rotted cloth, was a single-handed sword dating to approximately the 13th century. No body, no grave goods, no name. Erfurt has a documented history of Inquisition proceedings stretching back to the 1290s. The church above this chamber had been used for ecclesiastical hearings, the kind where men and women were brought before church authorities to account for what they believed. Swords had no place in that process, and they had no place beneath a church floor. The canonical world of medieval Christianity was rigidly ordered, and this object violated the logic of that order completely. What makes the find so unsettling is the deliberateness it implies. The chamber was sealed, the sword was wrapped. Someone made a careful, considered decision to conceal this blade in the most sacred ground available, in a building defined by religious authority, in a space where no secular weapon was ever supposed to rest. This was not an accident, it was an act. The Thuringian State Office for Heritage Management took custody of the sword and confirmed its dating to the 13th century through metallurgical analysis. The cruciform hilt and blade geometry are consistent with a weapon of moderate quality, neither a peasant's tool nor a nobleman's showpiece. The identity of the person who placed it there, and the reason they chose that particular floor in that particular building, has not been established. The church kept meticulous records. Whatever happened in that chamber, whoever hid that blade and why, did not make it into any of them. Who hides a sword in holy ground, and what were they trying to make disappear? Number 9. The Plague Sword. In 1349, the Black Death killed approximately a third of Tournai's population in less than a year. The Flemish chronicler Gilles Le Moisis recorded the scale of the dying in detail, documenting mass burials conducted with desperate speed as the city ran out of ways to cope with its dead. When archaeologists excavated one of those burial sites in 2003, they found something that had no reasonable explanation for being there. A broadsword, carefully placed, lying among hundreds of anonymous dead. Plague burials were functional. The priority was containment, not ritual. Bodies were interred quickly, sometimes without last rites, sometimes without any ceremony at all. Personal objects were occasionally buried with the dead, but those objects were small, incidental things. A sword was valuable. A sword was inherited, sold, or melted down. Burying one in a plague pit was an act that defied the economic logic of the medieval world entirely. Analysis by the Institut Royal des Sciences Naturelles de Belgique confirmed the blade as a 14th century type Ichin Saint in the oakshot typology, approximately 90 centimeters in length. The hilt fittings were of moderate quality. The sword did not belong to a peasant, but it did not belong to high nobility either. It occupied a middle rank, the kind of weapon owned by a minor knight, a wealthy merchant, or a professional soldier. No identifying marks were found on the blade. The burial context provided no indication of who had placed it there or which of the hundreds of bodies in the pit it had been intended to accompany. Whoever made that decision was almost certainly among the dead themselves before the season was out. The sword was placed there intentionally, in a pit full of people whose names the city had already stopped recording. Someone chose to bury it rather than keep it, sell it, or pass it on. Whatever they believed about that blade, they took the reason to their grave. Number 8. The Knight's Sword of Ronneby. In 1987, a farmer draining a waterlogged field near Ronneby in Blekinge County, Sweden, pulled a corroded object from the peat. When conservators at the Blekinge Museum in Karlskrona cleaned and examined it, they found a 13th century knightly sword in a state of preservation that should not have been possible after 700 years in the ground. The blade geometry was intact. Partial organic material on the grip had survived. The sword looked, in certain respects, as though it had simply been waiting. Blekinge was a contested border region throughout the medieval period, disputed between Denmark and Sweden for centuries before the Treaty of Roskilde finally settled the question in 1658. The land carried the memory of raids, sieges, and territorial campaigns that left no permanent monuments. What it did leave was what the peat took and kept, held in anaerobic conditions that stopped decay almost entirely. The metallurgical profile of the blade identified it as high carbon steel consistent with Rhineland manufacture, meaning the sword was almost certainly imported. Rhineland blades were the premium product of the medieval arms trade, sought across northern Europe precisely because of their quality. A sword like this cost significant money. It ended up in an anonymous field with no body beside it, no armor, no other finds of any kind. The oakshot typology places it as a type thene, a double-edged weapon designed for the mounted warrior, approximately 95 centimeters in length. It was not a battlefield discard. Swords this fine were not thrown away. They were carried, treasured, and passed down through families for generations. For this one to end up alone in a peat field, something had to have gone wrong for its owner in a manner that left no other trace. Whose hand last held it, and what happened to them in the hours between that moment and the mud? Number 7. The Warlord Blade of Gokstad. When Norwegian antiquarian Nicolai Nicolaisen excavated the Gokstad burial mound in 1880, he expected something significant. What he uncovered exceeded every expectation. A 9th century Viking longship intact beneath the soil of Sandefjord in Vestfold. Dendrochronology later dating the vessel to approximately 895 AD. Among the weapons recovered from the burial was a blade that did not belong in a Norse grave. It was Frankish, of Carolingian manufacture, and it carried an inlaid inscription that specialists have never fully resolved. Frankish blades were the most prized weapons in early medieval Europe. The workshops of the Rhineland produced steel of a quality that Scandinavian smiths could not consistently replicate. And the best of these blades, those bearing workshop inscriptions in inlaid iron, were not trade goods. They were trophies, gifts between rulers, or the spoils of violence. Acquiring one required either extraordinary wealth, extraordinary connections, or a sword arm willing to take it from someone who already had it. The inscription on the Gokstad blade is partially legible, consistent in form with Carolingian workshop marks, but corroded beyond complete interpretation. It sits now in the Museum of Cultural History at the University of Oslo, alongside the other grave goods examined by specialists over more than a century without yielding a definitive reading. The letters that remain are enough to confirm the blade's continental origin, and enough to confirm that whoever commissioned it wanted their name, or their workshop's name, to last. The man buried at Gokstad chose to take a foreign sword into death rather than leave it for his heirs. That was a statement about what the blade meant to him, about what it represented in terms of his status, his history, and perhaps his identity. The man buried at Gokstad went to his grave with someone else's sword. Whether he traded for it, received it as tribute, or pulled it from a body on a field somewhere in Francia, the blade remembers, and it is not telling. Number 6. The Crusader Sword of Caesarea. On a morning in October 2021, an amateur diver named Shlomi Katzin was working a shallow reef off the coast of Caesarea Maritima in northern Israel when the sand shifted in the current and revealed the edge of something large lying in the sediment. He surfaced with the find and reported it immediately to the Israel Antiquities Authority. What he had pulled from the seabed was a Crusader-era sword, approximately 900 years old, its blade still structurally intact, its geometry preserved by the same sandy conditions that had concealed it for nearly a millennium. Caesarea served as one of the principal ports of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem from its capture in 1101 until its final fall in 1265. The harbor processed the armies of multiple crusades, the supply chains of a Christian state operating in hostile territory, and the desperate evacuations that followed every military reversal. The seabed beneath and around that harbor received, over those 164 years, a great deal that was never recovered. The Israel Antiquities Authority confirmed the blade at approximately 90 centimeters in length and dated to the Crusader occupation period. IAA officials described it publicly as a magnificent and rare find. The encrustation that coated it was consistent with centuries of submersion in the Mediterranean, but beneath that crust, the iron had held. The sword that emerged from the reef was recognizably a weapon, not a corroded fragment. What the IAA could not confirm was whose sword it had been. Caesarea changed hands repeatedly. It was taken, held, lost, retaken, and finally surrendered in a medieval world where the ownership of every object in the city was continuously in dispute. A recreational diver found this sword in water shallow enough to reach without specialist equipment, lying on a reef in plain sight. If this was resting undetected in the shallows, the question of what lies in the deeper water beneath one of the ancient world's most trafficked harbors is almost too large to hold in mind. Number 5. The Royal Longsword of the Thames. The Thames gives things back on its own schedule. In 2019, a mudlarker working a low-tide stretch of the foreshore near Battersea in London surfaced a sword so exceptionally preserved that conservators at the Museum of London initially struggled to account for its condition. The anaerobic silt of the Thames riverbed had done what museum storage aspires to do, sealing the blade in an oxygen-deprived environment that slowed decay to almost nothing. The sword that came out of the river was a 15th century longsword, and it almost certainly belonged to a man of significant rank. The 15th century in England was not a stable era. The Wars of the Roses, the dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York that consumed English noble society between 1455 and 1487, destroyed families, reversed fortunes, and made allegiances into life or death decisions that could change in the space of a single afternoon. Noble weapons did not end up in rivers by accident during that period. They ended up in rivers because keeping them was dangerous. The Museum of London catalogued the sword as an oakshot type B, approximately 100 centimeters in length, with a wheel pommel consistent with high-status ownership. No heraldic markings were identified on the blade or fittings. The sword carried no inscription that might resolve its ownership, nothing that could connect it to a name or a family or a moment in the wars that defined its era. The wheel pommel and blade quality placed this weapon in the hands of a knight, at minimum, possibly higher. The Thames foreshore near Battersea has yielded medieval objects before, but a longsword of this quality in this condition is not a routine find. The Wars of the Roses destroyed entire noble families within a generation. The sword that survives is so often the sword whose owner did not, thrown into the river by someone who understood that being found with it was more dangerous than losing it. Number 4. The Sword of Bosworth. On 22nd August 1485, Richard III rode into battle at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire and did not ride out. His death ended the Plantagenet dynasty, concluded the Wars of the Roses, and inaugurated the Tudor era in a matter of hours. For more than 5 centuries, the precise location of the battlefield remained disputed. Then, between 2005 and 2009, a project led by historian Glenn Ford for the Battlefields Trust and the University of Huddersfield conducted a systematic survey of the area around Fen Lane Farm near Market Bosworth, and the ground began to speak. Among the finds recovered from the confirmed battle deposit was a sword, dated to the late 15th century, found within the boundaries of the field where the medieval world ended. The survey's most celebrated individual find was a silver boar badge, the personal heraldic symbol of Richard III, worn by members of his household retinue. Its presence in the deposit confirmed for the first time that the survey team had located the correct ground. The same deposit yielded lead roundshot, subsequently identified as the earliest physical evidence of gunfire on an English battlefield, and a gold coin consistent with the period. A knightly sword recovered from within that deposit, from the same confirmed zone where Richard's household badge was found, carries implications that cannot be easily set aside. The identity of its owner is unknown. The circumstance in which it came to rest in that field is unrecorded. But a command-level weapon found in association with the remains of Richard III's personal retinue narrows the possibilities considerably. Glenn Ford's findings were published in full in Bosworth 1485, A Battlefield Rediscovered, and the methodology of the survey has been recognized as a model for battlefield archaeology. The physical evidence is not in dispute. Richard III's body lay beneath a Leinster car park for 527 years before anyone found it. The sword recovered from Bosworth Field belonged to someone who was present on the day the medieval world ended, someone whose name we do not know and whose final hours remain entirely unrecorded. Number 3. The Templar Sword of Acre. On 18th of May, 1291, the city of Acre fell to the Mamluk forces of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, and the Crusader presence on the mainland of the Holy Land ended. The Knights Templar, the military religious order that had anchored the Christian defense of the city, fought until their fortress tower collapsed on top of both their own remaining men and the Mamluk soldiers who had breached it. In 1994, construction workers in the modern Israeli city of Akko broke through the floor of a sealed subterranean chamber and discovered the remnants of the Templar compound that had survived beneath the city for 703 years. Among the material recovered and transferred to the Israel Antiquities Authority was a sword bearing a cross pate on its pommel, the cross of the Knights Templar. The Templars were among the most documented organizations of the medieval world. Founded in 1119, regulated by the rule of Saint Bernard, and ultimately dissolved by Pope Clement V on 22nd of March 1312, they generated records, property inventories, and trial transcripts that fill archives across Europe. The fall of Acre was recorded by multiple contemporary chroniclers. What happened to specific objects within the compound in the final hours before the tower came down was not among the things anyone survived to document. The sword recovered from the Akko chamber dates to the period of Crusader occupation, consistent with the decades immediately preceding 1291. The cross pate on the pommel is not decorative ambiguity, it is an identification, a declaration of belonging to an order whose last act in the Holy Land was to die inside a collapsing building rather than surrender. The Grand Master Thibaut. Gaudin escaped by sea with the Templar treasury in the final days before the city fell. The knights who remained behind left everything else in the fortress they had held. The sword now held at the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem was not lost in that chamber. It was left there in the wreckage of a cause that had already failed by men who knew they were not coming back. 703 years in a sealed room. The Templars who left Acre were dead within hours of setting it down. The order that had given their lives its meaning was dissolved 21 years later by a pope responding to political pressure from the French crown. The sword is the only thing that survived intact. Number 2. The Bishop's Blade of Ribe. In 2012, archaeologists working beneath the floor of Ribe Cathedral in Denmark, Scandinavia's oldest cathedral, opened a stone-lined grave that had been sealed since approximately the 12th century. Inside was a church official interred in the full material context of episcopal office, with remnants of vestments and a fragment of a pastoral staff. Beside him was a sword. The Museum of Southwest Jutland, the responsible institution for Ribe's heritage, confirmed the dating and the extraordinary nature of what the burial contained. Bishops were not buried with swords. Canon law, codified explicitly at the Third Lateral Council in 1179, prohibited clergy from bearing arms. Whoever sealed this grave did so knowing they were committing the dead man's memory to a deliberate, documented violation of church law. The sword itself is a single-handed weapon with a cruciform hilt approximately 80 centimeters in length, consistent with secular knightly manufacture of the period. It was not a ceremonial object. It was not a relic or a symbolic piece. It was a functional weapon of the kind carried by men whose profession was violence, placed beside a man whose profession was God. Ribe Cathedral was founded in stone around 1150 and served as the center of ecclesiastical authority for the surrounding region. Its records from the 12th and 13th centuries are incomplete, a gap that is common for this period but which here carries particular weight. The identity of the bishop in the sealed grave has not been established. His name, his diocese, his history, the specific circumstances of his life and death are all unrecorded in anything that has survived. Canon law said he could not carry a sword. Someone buried him with one in a sealed grave in the holiest building in Scandinavia, and the church's own records contain no explanation for what he was doing with it. The bishop in the sealed grave was not fully what his vestments suggested he was, and the sword is the only witness we have to whatever else he might have been. Some truths survive only because someone thought they had buried them deep enough to disappear, and that truth, lying beside him in the stone-lined dark for 8 centuries, outlasted everything they did to conceal it. Number 1. The execution sword of Verden. In 1938, a worker draining a canal outside Verden an der Aller in Lower Saxony, Germany, pulled an enormous 2-handed sword from the mud. It was 140 centimeters long. Its blade did not taper to a point. It ended in a squared-off tip because this sword was not designed to stab, not designed for battle, not designed for any of the purposes a sword conventionally serves. Etched along the flat of the blade were figures of the crucified Christ, the Virgin Mary, and a kneeling man before an executioner. This was a Richtschwert, an execution sword, a weapon built for a single specific, legally sanctioned, and repeated act. It was removed from the Domherrenhaus Museum in Verden, examined, dated to the 16th century, and catalogued as one of the most complete examples of its type recovered in Lower Saxony. The Richtschwert was a formal instrument of the Holy Roman Empire's justice system. Licensed state executioners, known as Scharfrichter, commissioned these swords personally at the beginning of their careers and carried them throughout. The weapons were blessed by the church, registered by civil authorities, and used exclusively by their designated bearers. They were not passed to heirs like ordinary swords. They were not sold or traded. They were among the most personally identified objects in the medieval and early modern world, bound to a single man, a single office, and a single function. The religious iconography etched into the blade was not decoration. It was a statement of theological justification, a declaration that the act the sword performed was sanctioned by God as well as by the state. A partially legible, Low German inscription ran along the ricasso of the blade, the unsharpened section above the hilt used as a secondary grip for close work. The language and phrasing are consistent with formulaic inscriptions documented on other Richtschwert held in the Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg and the Historisches Museum Frankfurt, invoking the executioner's duty to God, to the emperor, and to justice. Each of those institutions holds confirmed examples of the type, weapons that carry the same squared tip, the same religious imagery, the same cold formal weight. What makes the Verden sword different from those documented museum pieces is not what it is. It is where it was found. A Richtschwert did not belong in a canal. It belonged in the custody of the man who carried it, and when that man died, it belonged in whatever arrangement his city or his guild made for the disposal of an instrument of execution. It did not belong in the water. For this sword to end up in a drainage canal, the man who owned it had to have chosen to put it there, or someone who came after him had to have made that choice on his behalf, and in either case, the choice was made in the knowledge of what the sword was and what it had done. The Scharfrichter was not a soldier. He was not a warrior in any conventional sense. He was a civic officer, a professional, a man whose entire identity was built around a sanctioned and repeated act of state violence, performed with legal authority, religious blessing, and this blade. Every execution he carried out with this sword was recorded somewhere in the court documents of the Holy Roman Empire. The sword's history, in principle, is a history of those records. In practice, the sword ended up in a canal, which means that at some point the man who carried it, or the person tasked with accounting for his estate, decided that the history it represented was better submerged than preserved. The execution sword of Verden is the most honest object in this entire list. Every other sword hides its story in absence, in unanswered questions about lost owners and unknown battles and forgotten graves. This sword does not hide what it is. The squared tip tells you. The kneeling figure on the blade tells you. The religious blessing etched into the steel tells you exactly what this object was made to do, and it tells you that the people who made it and used it believed that what they were doing was right, was lawful, and was holy. The sword that ends up in a canal is the sword that someone at some point could no longer say that about. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.